The Pathfinder probe was a relic of an ambitious era, a time when humanity believed it could pierce the veil of the cosmos and emerge unscathed. Launched 30 years ago, it had been built to survive unimaginable conditions: deep space radiation, gravitational anomalies, and the vast cold silence beyond the edges of the solar system. Yet, no one had anticipated it would come back. The mission was always one way. When the first faint signal reached the Earth's deep space network, it was met with disbelief. The transmission was garbled, punctuated by bursts of static and strange, unidentifiable clicks. But it bore Pathfinder's unique signature. For weeks, engineers argued over the implications. Could it be a delayed echo, a ghost signal bouncing through the cosmos? Or had the probe, against all odds, found its way home? Then the coordinates came through, specific, deliberate. The probe wasn't just broadcasting, it was heading directly for Earth. The descent was almost theatrical, a glowing streak cutting through the Nevada sky, its battered frame wrapped in a thin layer of atmospheric fire. Military personnel and scientists scrambled to the site, their excitement tinged with unease. Pathfinder wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of humanity's reach, the bold ambition to touch the untouchable. But the scars on its hull suggested it had touched something that had pushed back. When the retrieval team reached it, they found the probe half buried in the sand, its once sleek surface marred by jagged gashes. The metal was discolored, streaked with what looked like organic residue, a dark, resinous substance that flaked off at the slightest touch. The team erected floodlights around the site, their beams catching glimpses of something unsettling. The gashes didn't look like the result of collisions with debris or micrometeoroids. They looked deliberate, as though something had clawed its way into the probe or out of it. Dr. Elena Vega, the mission's original lead scientist, arrived hours later. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray and her confidence tempered by years of bureaucratic stonewalling. Yet seeing Pathfinder again ignited something in her, a mix of pride and dread. She stood at the edge of the retrieval zone, her breath visible in the cold night air, staring at the probe as though it might recognize her. "Careful," she called out to the team handling the transport, her voice firm. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Inside the research facility, Pathfinder was treated like a relic of a lost civilization. Its charred shell was lowered onto a reinforced platform in a sealed lab, and a team of engineers, biologists, and physicists swarmed around it. Elena stayed at the periphery, watching as they dissected the probe systems. Her fingers itched to touch it, to pry open its secrets, but something held her back. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the feeling that the probe was waiting. The initial data retrieval was a revelation. 30 years' worth of telemetry poured into the servers, a river of data detailing distant stars, gravitational distortions, and faint traces of exotic particles never seen before. But buried within the scientific logs were anomalies, recordings that didn't match the probe's design specifications. Audio files, video clips, and strange symbols scratched into its interior casing. "Could it be contamination?" one of the engineers asked as the team examined the symbols. They looked almost organic, like the tracks left by some microscopic organism crawling across the probe's surface. "Contamination from what?" Elena muttered, her eyes locked on the screen. Pathfinder didn't land anywhere. It wasn't built to. Later that evening, Elena stayed behind while the others filed out. The lab was silent except for the soft hum of servers processing the probe's data. She approached Pathfinder cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Up close, the scars on its surface seemed almost alive, their edges curling inward like scabbed-over wounds. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the metal. A burst of static crackled through the speakers. Elena froze, her hand jerking back. On the monitors, the data feed faltered, the steady stream of telemetry breaking into fragments. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking, like the chittering of insects, growing louder with each passing second. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the probe. "Elena," a voice whispered, low and distorted. Her name, stretched and warped, emanated from the machine. She staggered backward, her heart hammering. The monitors flickered, and for a brief moment an image appeared on the main screen. A forest of dark tendrils writhed against a backdrop of stars, their movements jerky and unnatural. In the center of the mass, a cluster of eyes blinked open, their gaze fixed on the camera. Then the screen went dark. "Elena!" The voice was louder now, almost a scream. She stumbled out of the lab, her breath ragged, and slammed the door behind her. In the days that followed, the team discovered more anomalies, glimpses of things Pathfinder had seen, recordings it had made that defied logic. A jagged asteroid that moved against all known physics, a field of organic-looking structures floating in the void, and always the clicking sounds, growing louder and more erratic. Then they found the final recording, buried deep in the probe's memory. A voice, human but barely recognizable, whispered a single phrase before the feed cut to black. "It's here. It's inside." Elena couldn't sleep that night. She sat alone in her quarters, staring at the walls, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. She knew one thing for certain. Whatever had followed Pathfinder home wasn't done with them yet. The first week of analyzing Pathfinder's recovered data was an exercise in both wonder and frustration. The probe had captured extraordinary sights, gas giants cloaked in storms of impossible colors, a dying star collapsing into a black hole, and vast, shimmering fields of what appeared to be metallic dust drifting in the void. These images alone would have cemented the mission as one of the greatest achievements in human history. But it wasn't the majestic sights that haunted the team. It was the anomalies. Among the thousands of hours of recorded footage and telemetry were fragmented files, corrupted or overwritten by something unknown. The files contained images that defied explanation, blurry frames of shadowy masses moving unnaturally, and faint audio clips of sounds no one could identify. At first, the team assumed these were artifacts of deep space radiation or corrupted data. Then they noticed a pattern. The anomalies became more frequent as Pathfinder moved deeper into uncharted space. Elena was the first to suggest a deliberate interference. "This isn't random noise," she said, gesturing at a screen displaying one of the corrupted files. "There's intent here. Something was trying to communicate." The team wasn't convinced until they uncovered a sequence of audio logs, labeled only with a string of garbled characters. When played, the first few logs were distorted bursts of static, punctuated by faint clicking sounds. But as the logs progressed, the clicking evolved into a rhythmic pattern, almost like a language. It was unsettling, a sound that seemed to burrow into the mind and linger long after it stopped. Then came the visual anomalies. One recording, labeled Year 7, showed Pathfinder approaching what appeared to be a dense nebula. The probe's instruments registered it as an organic structure, a vast, sprawling mass stretching across light years, its surface rippling as though alive. For 3 hours, the cameras captured the probe's slow passage through the nebula. At first, the footage showed only the swirling, pulsating mass, but then something changed. Shapes began to emerge from the haze, spindly, angular forms that moved in erratic, stuttering motions. They seemed to notice Pathfinder, converging toward it before disappearing into the darkness. The playback ended abruptly, but not before a chilling distortion overtook the footage. For a split second, the screen was filled with an image of what looked like a human face, twisted and deformed, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. The team dismissed it as a data glitch. Elena wasn't so sure. As the weeks turned into months, the team uncovered more unsettling records. The rhythmic clicking became a constant presence, growing louder and more distinct in the later logs. Shadows appeared in the footage, unnatural shapes that moved across the probe's hull, their forms shifting and twisting as though they were fluid. One recording showed the shadows splitting apart, forming tendrils that snaked across the camera's field of view before retracting into the void. Then came the memories. They weren't labeled, and their origins defied explanation. The first was a recording of what seemed to be a planet, an Earth-like world covered in dense forests and still lakes. The scene was tranquil, almost beautiful, until the trees began to move. Their branches twisted unnaturally, merging into each other to form towering structures that pulsed with a faint light. The lake rippled, and from its surface emerged something massive, its form obscured by the camera's static. The second memory was even more inexplicable. It depicted the interior of a vast, cavernous structure, its walls lined with what looked like organic growths. The air shimmered with an oily iridescence, and the floor was littered with fragments of metal and bone. As the camera panned across the scene, a figure appeared, human in shape but horribly wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its skin translucent, revealing veins filled with dark, viscous liquid. The figure turned to face the camera, its mouth opening in an unnatural, soundless scream before the feed cut out. "None of this is possible," whispered Mark Holloway, the team's lead engineer, as he watched the playback. "The probe couldn't have gone anywhere near a planet like that. It didn't land. It didn't enter any structures. This is something else." Elena didn't respond. She was too focused on the next file, her heart pounding as she clicked to open it. The final memory was the most disturbing of all. The footage was shaky, the camera jerking as though the probe itself were being torn apart. The view alternated between glimpses of an alien landscape and the probe's own interior, panels being pried open by long, spindly appendages. A wet, sucking noise filled the audio, accompanied by faint whispers in a language no one recognized. The footage ended with a shot of a mass of tendrils slithering into the probe's core, their movements almost surgical. As the memory played, the rhythmic clicking returned, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the probe itself. "Elena," a voice whispered faintly. She froze, staring at the probe. The voice wasn't recorded. It was live, distorted and broken, but unmistakably human. "Elena," it said again, the tone now pleading. "Help us. It's inside. It's..." The voice cut out, replaced by a deafening burst of static. The team stared at the probe in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "What the hell was that?" Mark finally asked, his voice trembling. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. All she knew was that the memories weren't just records of what the probe had seen. They were something else, something alive, clawing its way into their minds. Mark Holloway didn't think much of the cut at first. It was small, a shallow nick on his palm from handling one of Pathfinder's external panels. The probe's scarred exterior was sharp in places, its jagged edges a reminder of its harrowing journey. He washed the wound, shrugged it off, and returned to work. By the next morning, the cut was no longer a simple abrasion. His skin around it had become pale, almost translucent, with faint black veins spidering outward from the wound. He tried to convince himself it was just an infection, perhaps some unknown chemical residue from the probe. But when he pressed on the area, it felt wrong, soft, gelatinous, as if something beneath the surface was shifting. Elena found him in the lab, hunched over his workstation, sweating and pale. "Mark, you look awful," she said, her voice laced with concern. "It's nothing," he muttered, keeping his hand tucked under the desk. "Just a little under the weather." But as the day wore on, Mark's condition deteriorated. He became increasingly agitated, mumbling to himself in broken fragments of sentences. By the time he collapsed, the black veins had spread up his arm, branching out like an invasive network of roots. When the team rushed him to the medical bay, they discovered that the infection had spread internally as well. Scans revealed that his blood had thickened into a tar-like substance, and his organs had begun to shift in ways that defied human anatomy. Elena and the medical staff stood over him as he writhed on the gurney, his screams punctuated by choking guttural noises. His body convulsed violently, and then as suddenly as it began, he went still. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint beeping of monitors. Then Mark opened his eyes. "Elena," he croaked, his voice strained and unnatural. His pupils were black, his irises ringed with a faint, iridescent glow. "I'm here," she said, stepping closer, though every instinct screamed at her to back away. "It's not me," he whispered, his words slurred. His body began to jerk again, his limbs bending at grotesque angles. Bones cracked audibly as his arms lengthened, the skin stretching thin over newly formed joints. A gurgling sound emerged from his throat, and then he screamed. A sound so guttural and alien that everyone in the room recoiled. The medical team scrambled to restrain him, but Mark was no longer human. He moved with unnatural strength and speed, snapping the restraints as though they were paper. His skin began to slough off in patches, revealing glistening, sinewy tissue beneath. Tendrils erupted from his chest, whipping through the air and embedding themselves in the walls. He let out another guttural scream before collapsing into a spasming heap. It took hours for the team to sedate him, and even then his body continued to twitch, his distorted form barely resembling the man they had known. "We need to quarantine the probe," Elena said afterward, her voice shaking. "Now!" But it was too late. The next day, another member of the team, Dr. Weiss, developed symptoms. Unlike Mark, she had never touched the probe directly. Her only exposure had been proximity to its exterior during the initial analysis. Her symptoms began with a persistent itching in her arms and legs. By the afternoon, her skin was rippling, as though something beneath it was trying to break free. "I feel it," she whispered to Elena in the hallway, her voice trembling. "It's inside me." The transformation was faster this time. By the evening, Weiss's arms had fused into grotesque, claw-like appendages, her spine arched unnaturally, and her mouth gaped open in a soundless scream. Her body convulsed violently, and something tore free from her chest, a mass of writhing tendrils that thrashed wildly before collapsing into a twitching pile on the floor. The infection spread rapidly through the facility. Some succumbed quickly, their bodies contorting and twisting into horrific shapes. Others experienced slower, more insidious transformations, their symptoms varying widely. One man's eyes fused shut, his eyelids growing over with thick, translucent skin. Another woman's torso split open like a blooming flower, revealing rows of sharp, serrated teeth where her ribs had been. Each new case was more grotesque and horrifying than the last. The team tried to destroy the probe, but every attempt was thwarted. The organic residue on its surface seemed to repair damage almost instantly, growing over the cuts and burns like living tissue. The rhythmic clicking that had haunted the data logs now echoed through the facility, a constant, maddening pulse that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elena barricaded herself in the control room, her mind racing. The infection wasn't just biological, it was psychological. She could feel it creeping into her thoughts, a cold, alien presence that whispered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just killing them, it was changing them, rewriting their bodies and minds to serve some unfathomable purpose. When she reviewed the latest recordings from the probe, she finally understood. The rhythmic clicking wasn't random, it was a language, and the message it carried was clear. Host identified, integration underway. Elena felt a sharp pain in her chest and looked down to see the first black vein snaking its way across her skin. The infection had found her too. She was running out of time. Her hands trembled as she activated the facility's lockdown protocols, sealing the infected inside. She had to stop it, whatever the cost. But as she stared at the monitors, watching her team's twisted forms moving in unnatural synchronization, she realized the horrifying truth. They weren't infected. They were becoming something. And whatever they were becoming was no longer human. The control room was deathly quiet, save for the faint hum of the monitors. Elena Vega sat alone, her chest heaving as she struggled to focus through the haze of pain. The black veins crawling up her arms had reached her neck, and every beat of her heart sent a dull ache through her body. She could feel it now, the alien presence burrowing into her thoughts, rearranging them piece by piece. It whispered to her, not in words but in sensations, hunger, expansion, inevitability. Her trembling hands hovered over the console. The facility's fail-safe system was armed, ready to release a concentrated electromagnetic pulse that would annihilate the probe and everything else within a 50-mile radius. It was a crude solution, but it was the only way. She couldn't let it spread. Whatever this thing was, whatever pathogen it carried, it couldn't be allowed to reach the outside world. But the warning had to be sent first. Elena leaned forward, her breath fogging the screen as she typed a desperate message into the terminal. The words blurred in her vision, her hands clumsy and weak. She felt the alien tendrils tightening their grip on her mind, urging her to stop, to let go. Her muscles twitched involuntarily, her body no longer entirely her own. "To anyone who finds this," she typed, her fingers moving slower with each keystroke. "This is Dr. Elena Vega. We were wrong. The probe, it wasn't just a machine. It was carrying something, a living entity. It's inside us now, changing us. This is a warning. Do not..." Her hands froze. For a moment she couldn't move, her body locked in place. A wave of euphoria washed over her, a false, honeyed sense of peace that made her want to surrender. She felt the presence coaxing her, telling her that resistance was futile, that this was evolution, that this was right. But then she remembered Mark's screams. She remembered Weiss clawing at her own skin, the terrified faces of her team as their bodies were reshaped into grotesque forms. She remembered what it felt like to look into their eyes and see something else staring back. Gritting her teeth, Elena forced her fingers to move. The message sent. The monitors flickered, and for a moment she thought the pulse had already fired. But then she realized the flickering wasn't a malfunction. It was the probe. It was reacting. On the main screen, the live feed from the lab showed the probe splitting open like a cocoon, its scarred surface peeled back, revealing the pulsating, amorphous mass within. Tendrils writhed and lashed out, embedding themselves in the walls and ceiling. The rhythmic clicking had grown deafening, now accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The mass expanded, and from its core emerged something new, a towering, multi-limbed creature, its skin glistening with an oily sheen. Its head, or what passed for a head, turned toward the camera, dozens of glowing eyes locking onto Elena's face. And then it spoke, not in clicks or whispers, but in her own voice. "Elena," it said, the sound so perfectly replicated that it felt like hearing her own thoughts. "You don't have to fight. You can join us. You can be more." Her fingers hovered over the final command. The creature tilted its head, studying her through the screen. "You think you're saving them," it said, its tone soft, almost kind. "But you're only delaying the inevitable. We are already here. We have always been here." Elena slammed her fist against the console, silencing the voice. She couldn't listen. She couldn't hesitate. Tears streamed down her face as she initiated the sequence. The facility's alarms blared, the room bathed in red light. The countdown began. 30 seconds. Outside the control room, the infected had gathered, their twisted forms pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in unison as they chanted words she couldn't understand. Their bodies pulsed in rhythm with the clicking, as though tethered to the probe. 15 seconds. Elena's vision blurred, her strength waning. She sank to the floor, clutching her chest as the veins reached her face. The pain was unbearable, but she held on, focusing on the timer. She had to hold on. Just a little longer. 5 seconds. The tendrils in her mind thrashed wildly, sensing the end. The alien presence screamed, a sound that filled her head with white-hot agony. But she didn't stop. She closed her eyes, letting the countdown's final beeps carry her into silence. When the pulse detonated, it was like a second sunrise. A wave of electromagnetic energy rippled across the desert, vaporizing the facility in an instant. The blast consumed everything, the probe, the infected, and Elena herself. For a moment, the night was filled with light, and then it was gone, leaving behind only scorched earth and an eerie, unnatural stillness. Days later, a recovery team arrived, sent by the corporation that had funded the original mission. They found no survivors, only a charred crater where the facility had once stood. Officially, the incident was classified as a catastrophic equipment failure, an unfortunate loss for science. But not everything had been destroyed. Buried beneath the rubble, shielded from the pulse by a layer of scorched debris, a single fragment of the probe's casing remained intact. It was small, no larger than a coin, and faintly warm to the touch. The recovery team logged it without suspicion, packing it into a secure container for transport back to headquarters. As they drove away, none of them noticed the faint clicking sound emanating from the container. Rhythmic, persistent, alive.